United Kingdom.
Imber Village is an abandoned village located on the Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England. It is now owned by the Ministry of Defence and is used as an army training ground for the British Armed Forces. The mentions of Imber Village go back to the Iron Age, anywhere between 800 and 100 BCE, although at the time it would have been a much smaller settlement. During the Saxon period, the first mentions of Imber by name were recorded in 967. About a century later, in 1086, Imber is recorded in the Domesday Book, then known as Immenbury, home to about 7 households at the time. Another couple of centuries later, in the 13th century, St. Giles's Church was built and still stands today. Even though the village is no longer inhabited, the church is still functioning and still houses the famous 15th century frescoes. By the 14th century, Imber now had a population of 250 and stayed around that right up until the 19th century, when the village numbers got up to the mid-400s. It was shortly after this that the War Office began buying up lands on the Salisbury Plain, owing to the rural communities and sparse land. Initially, the War Office was buying land around the village to use for training exercises. This continued into the 20th century, with the War Office continuing to buy land from farmers and locals. They even started evicting locals and assuming ownership after the Great Depression. By the time World War II had started, the vast majority of land in and around Imber now belonged to the War Office. On November 1st, 1943, the last residents of Imber were called to a village meeting and were given 47 days' notice to leave, with the promise of eventual return. In a show of support to the war effort, the majority of villagers complied without resistance and even left their non-perishable goods to the army as a gesture of support. From now on, the village was to be used by the US Allied Forces for training, hence some of the street names paying homage to America. As a tribute to the village blacksmith, his body was brought back to Imber for burial, said to have died from a broken heart of being forced out of the village against his will. After the war, the village continued to be used for army training. Even though the residents were promised they could return, this has never been followed through. A rally was held in the 1960s to allow the residents to return, with over 2,000 supporters showing up, but the Ministry of Defence refused to relinquish control. The issue even made it into the House of Lords, but attempts were still unsuccessful. The issue was brought back to public attention again in the 70s, and even a civil case was opened where soldiers and residents alike presented evidence that they were promised their return. Still, the Defence Land Committee refused to release the land and started building mock houses for additional army training purposes. Imber then went on to be used by British army units preparing to be sent into Ireland during the Troubles. The only success out of attempts to regain control of the land was the granting that the church be maintained and available for worship one day a year on the Saturday closest to St. Giles's Day. Today, the village continues to be used by the Ministry of Defence for training and is shut off to public access but for a few days of the year. Today, several of the original houses still stand, as well as the Bell Inn pub, the Manor House, Imber Court, the schoolroom, 4 1930s council houses, and of course St. Giles's Church. The church holds a service once a year on the Saturday closest to St. Giles's Day, where the public are allowed to return. Imber is also open to the public on some bank holidays and sometimes around Christmas, and recently has started opening up more frequently during the summer holidays. There's now even a bus route through it, but doesn't stop in Imber. A funny fact today about Imber is that even though it has no residents, it's still represented in Parliament by the member for South West Wiltshire and on Wiltshire Council. Imber has also appeared in popular culture, having been the set for film, drama and music videos. The church has even hosted orchestra, electronic and folk groups. If you want to visit Imber Village, you can only visit on the days that it's open to the public, which unfortunately doesn't stick to a set schedule. Your best bet is to keep an eye on their website, or the website of St. Giles's Church to check when you can visit. You'll need to get to it by car as it's very rural, or you can cycle to it from the closest villages. The closest train station is Warminster.